genocide. I first came across this thought-provoking and beautifully curated exhibition in May of last year, when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington launched this exhibition. Although it seemed like a long shot, I asked my team to set up an appointment with the USHMM, as I wanted the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center to host this amazing exhibition in partnership with the USHMM. After many months of negotiations and meetings, I'm happy to say that Burma's path to genocide can be viewed on the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide's website. As a center, we strive to work towards creating a more caring and just society in which human rights and diversity are respected and valued. It would therefore be appropriate to use this exhibition as a tool for education to learn about the Rohingya, a religious and ethnic minority in Burma, and to find out how they were discriminated against, dehumanized, and attacked. This exhibition explores how the Rohingya slowly went from citizens to outsiders, and how the 2017 violence forms part of a larger, sustained campaign of genocide. I'm indeed very humbled to welcome our three esteemed panelists, who all have a long history of activism and all played an instrumental role in the development and curation of this exhibition. Andrea Gittleman is a senior program manager for the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, where she focuses on policy outreach, justice, and accountability efforts for mass atrocities and leads the center's work on Burma, Myanmar. Previously, she was interim director of US policy and senior legislative counsel at Physicians for Human Rights, where she designed advocacy and policy strategies on a broad range of international human rights issues, including mass atrocities. Prior to that, she served as the Arthur Hilton Global Human Rights Fellow with the Burma's Lawyers Council in Mae Sot, Thailand, where she coordinated an international advocacy campaign for criminal accountability in Burma. Our second panelist is Wai Wai Nu, a former political prisoner and the founder and executive director of the Women's Peace Network in Burma. She spent 7 years as a political prisoner in Burma, and since her release from prison in 2012, Wai Wai has dedicated herself to working for democracy and human rights, particularly on behalf of marginalized women and members of her ethnic group, the Rohingya. Through the Women's Peace Network, she works to build peace and mutual understanding between Burma's ethnic communities and to empower and advocate for the rights of marginalized women throughout Burma, and particularly in Rakhine State. Her work also aims to reduce discrimination and hatred amongst Buddhist and Muslim communities and to improve the human rights of the Rohingya people through documentation, convenings, and policy advocacy among key leaders in Burma and high-level international fora. Our third but not last panelist is Greg Constantine. He's an American-Canadian documentary photographer who has dedicated his career to projects that focus on human rights, injustice, identity, and the power of the state. He spent 11 years working on the acclaimed project Nowhere People. In 2016, he launched his most recent project, 7 Doors, which documents and explores policies of immigration, detention, and its impact on migrants and immigrants in several countries around the world. He is the author of 3 books, including Exile to Nowhere, Burma's Rohingya in 2012, and Nowhere People in 2015, both of which were named Notable Photo Books of the Year by Photo District News magazine. Solo exhibitions of his work have been held in over 50 countries worldwide. In 2016, he earned his PhD from Middlesex University in the UK. He has been a distinguished visiting fellow with the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary University of London and a 2018-19 fellow with the Independent Social Research Foundation. Greg has spent the past 14 years documenting the persecution and genocide of the Rohingya community from Burma. His work on the Rohingya has been featured twice by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in their Our Walls Bear Witness program. He's the guest curator on the exhibition Burma's Path to Genocide. This exhibition features many of his photographs and personal stories based on his interviews. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. For the duration of the talk, all cameras and audios will be switched off. There will be a question and answer session after our panel discussion. And for ease of identifying all of your questions, please will you write up the questions in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. Should anybody wish to ask any of the panelists a question at the end of the session, you can put up your hand and we will open your camera and audio. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first panelist, Andrea Gittleman.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you to the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center for organizing this event and being a wonderful partner in moving this exhibition forward. And thank you for all of you joining us today. I'm going to speak briefly and give you some background on the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide and explain a bit about why we wanted to do a project like this to tell the story of the Rohingya people and of Burma's path to genocide. So the overall goal of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is to sustain the memory and the permanent relevance of the Holocaust, to support survivors and victims, to create a world where people confront hate and injustice and prevent genocide. Within that institution exists our Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide, where we aim to ignite effective, timely responses where communities are at risk of genocide and other mass atrocities today. We seek to end these crimes when they occur and also support efforts to promote justice and accountability. We work along this spectrum, looking at early response, relief, and redress in a number of cases. One of those cases is Burma, also called Myanmar, and the museum has been working to prevent and halt mass atrocities in Burma since 2013, although as Wai Wai will explain in a moment, the history of atrocities in the country goes back much farther than that. The museum determined in late December 2018 that there is compelling evidence that genocide had been committed against the Rohingya population in Burma. We have held public events, we've participated in policy discussions, conducted research, released reports, and then most recently, as we'll hear about today, worked with curator Greg Constantine to create this online exhibition, which really explores how the Rohingya people went from citizens to outsiders to victims of genocide within Burma. So why would the Holocaust Museum want to create an exhibit like this? And this goes back to the reason that our Simon Skjodt Center focuses on cases of mass atrocity today. We know that the Holocaust was a unique event, but there are lessons from that event that are instructive today for preventing genocide and effectively responding to it. We want to make sure that when visitors come to our museum, whether that's the physical space or our website, that they learn not only the history of the Holocaust, but that they also learn about genocide happening today. In the case of the genocide against the Rohingya people is rather instructive for us because it's one recent example of the world's failure to prevent genocide. It's a call for visitors to consider the urgency of genocide prevention and provoke questions about what people can do to respond to the risk of genocide today. At a fundamental level, as Greg will explain later, the exhibition tells audiences that genocide did not end with the Holocaust and that it still happens today, that it is preventable, it is not inevitable, that it's often a long process for which there are many warning signs. So instead of a flurry of sudden violence, it's rather a long process that we can see unfolding. And also to remember that communities across the world remain at risk of genocide today. We also want to guard against genocide denial with that the Burmese government is perpetuating. Creating an exhibition like this is one way of helping to set the historical record of what has happened. And it was always our plan to create a digital exhibition to enhance the reach of our resources. And we're very fortunate to have this partnership to extend that reach even farther. We're glad to have been able to meet the challenge of our current times when people cannot come into the physical museum and when people are engaging with material like this online. We will have a physical version of the exhibition that will open to the public once the pandemic situation allows us to do so. We're very excited to share more about this particular resource. We're excited for people across the world to use it as an educational tool to learn more about what has happened to the Rohingya people. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Wai Wai Nu, a Rohingya activist who can explain a bit more about the history and the context of the situation.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you to the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center for this opportunity. I would like to explain a bit about the background and history of the Rohingya people. As you can see on on the exhibit, creating the people outsiders. It's one thing that I have learned during this, during my fellowship at the Holocaust Museum, Simon Scott Center for the Genocide, Prevention of Genocide, CPG, learning about Holocaust and working on this on Burma issue. The Holocaust actually did not happen at once. It's not a one-time event, and so does the Burma situation, the Rohingya situations. It did not happen. It's not one event. It's a process. It's a process, long process of like decades long persecution of our people. And in the case of Rohingya, if we go back to the Burma's history and Rohingya history, Rohingya in Burma before, Rohingya, and there was another ethnic group called Rakhine. In Rakhine state, used to live side by side together for centuries in the history in the kingdom of, or in the independent nation state of Arakan, today where we call as Rakhine state, today which become part of the Burma. But over the past 200 years, Burma was occupied, the Rakhine state or Arakan state was occupied by different countries, different states, which include Burmese and Burma itself, and then British and then Japanese, and Burma regained independence in that area, and as a country Burma, including the Rakhine state. So in 1945, Rakhine state was part of this Burma's independence. So basically we become part of the Burma, part of Myanmar or Burma. So even after this independence, Rohingya in Rakhine state lived side by side again with Rakhine populations and enjoyed full citizenship rights, equal citizenship rights until 1962. when we had a military coup. The military leader at that time, General Une Win, he introduces these policies against the Rohingya populations, saying that basically describing Rohingya as outsiders or foreigners. Therefore, they must introduce they must introduce law, they must introduce legislations that restrict this population's ability to enjoy full and equal citizenship rights. From there, he's introduced two major, one law and then one like regulations. So first law is that the Citizenship Law, which is also called 1982 Citizenship Law, which removed Rohingyas' birthright as birth citizenship. And then he introduced this list of the ethnic nationality of the country as a list of 135 people. At that time, 134, and then later on 135. And that again excluded Rohingya from the list. So basically, since Rohingya are not on that list of the ethnic nationality of the country, then Rohingya, according to the 1982 Citizenship Law, Rohingya's birth citizenship was de facto removed. It was in 1982. Since then, the Burmese military leaderships introduced many forms of discriminatory practices and policies in Rakhine State against the Rohingya populations that include their ability to give birth, to ability to marry, ability to access to healthcare, or ability to go to the universities or obtain education, receive educations, and so on. Alongside with that, the discriminatory, there has been severe form of tortures and abuses, violations of the active form of abuses against the Rohingya populations, like forced labor or arbitrary arrest, the practices of extrajudicial killing, the practices of rape to demoralize the society, the impunity that has given to the security sectors and general people against the Rohingya populations has been a common practice. Extortions and many other forms of physical and mental violence has been there. And with these practices and the policies that put in place and limitation that has existed in Rakhine State, the community, the Rohingya and Rakhine communities lived in Rakhine State, two major ethnic groups. The inequality between the community has increased in a very dangerous level, where we can even see the practices as normalized, and that somehow become like the practices of apartheid. And in many cases, people are even physically segregated and cannot engage or associate or coexist in many cities and many villages. That has become a common practices in Rakhine State. And these situations in general over the past 25 or 30 years generated all of this hate and enabled Myanmar government and military in 2017 to carry out a bigger level of atrocity crimes and violence against the Rohingya populations that that resulted the displacements of about more than 800,000 people and many being killed, about 400 villages, which is like 75% of Rohingyas. Rohingyas villages in northern Rakhine State were destroyed, and many women were killed, and many lost their family members, and become living in the largest refugee camps in Bangladesh at this point. And what I'm trying to say is this is the processes that the world has ignored over the past 20 plus years, and that ignorance and that failure to address and take early actions has resulted these atrocity crimes. And even now, even so, the world continue to fail, and still there is no accountability and justice for the crimes that has been committed against the Rohingya populations in 2007. And now, even today, the Rohingya continue to live under all of this severe form of the discriminations and persecutions, and it's continuing today, even because there has not been, although there are some accountability processes ongoing before the International Court of Justice, or and investigations initiated by the International Criminal Court, but there hasn't been an kind of enough or adequate or stronger actions taken by the states and the UN. Therefore, Myanmar is not actually listening to the courts or taking any necessary steps to address the violations, the policies that they practice against the Rohingya populations in Rakhine State. I will stop here. I will let Greg continue to explain more about the exhibit itself.
Hi there. Thank you, Wai Wai and Andrea, and thank you to Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center for hosting the online exhibition. I think we're all incredibly excited about, like Andrea said, the opportunity for the exhibition to have an extended reach there in South Africa and beyond. I'm going to build on what Andrea and Wai Wai said, and I'm going to share my screen because that'll be the best way for me to kind of walk people through the exhibition. So let me share my screen right now. We started planning and working through how to tell this story. This would have been starting in April of 2019. And as Wai Wai kind of expressed, I mean, there's a deep history and a very complex history behind this story. So what are some of the things that we were challenged with at the very beginning of this process, and what kind of calculations did we have to make in terms of how to best tell this story? One was, how do we express the history behind what has led and to what happened in 2017? I think that one of the things that we realized early on is that it was really important for us to be able to communicate how genocide is a process, like Andrea said, how this was not just some spontaneous event that took place in 2017, that there were actually decades of policies, procedures, perpetrators that were all put in place, that all in one way or another, building off of each other, led to what happened in 2017, or actually created a situation that could then lead to what happened in 2017 with this clearance operation that took place by the Burmese military in the Rakhine State, that then led to thousands of people dying from the Rohingya community villages, Rohingya villages all across the state being basically destroyed, and over 700,000 Rohingya fleeing from Burma into neighboring Bangladesh. So one of the things that was crucially important for us was to show this process, just like the title of the exhibition says, this path. What is the path that the Burmese authorities and various people over the course of 50 decades or 5 decades took to lead us to 2017? The other part was, how do we, what are the different paths that we can create for visitors to actually engage with this story? We've chosen 2 different kind of paths, as you'll see. When you come into the exhibition, to the homepage, there people will have 2 different options. They can they can learn about the history of the persecution of the Rohingya, which is one pathway of learning about the story, and the second one is to go through and learn about the individual stories of certain people that I met along the way, who share what happened to them both before 2017, during 2017, and after 2017. So I'm going to start with the historical part, because we felt that for people to fully appreciate the atrocities that took place, and also the tragedy that's happened to the Rohingya community, it's almost essential for people to understand what this community had before everything went wrong. What is the history behind how this community was actually part and parcel of Burmese society, participated in Burmese society in so many different ways. And just like the title of this event, we're citizens of a country. So what we do is we basically break down the whole entire historical section into 5 different chapters. The first chapter is very much heavily focused on presenting and creating a context that's essential for people to understand in terms of who this community is, where they actually are from and belong, and all of those things that they did, or as much as we can share with people in an online exhibition, all of those things that created the identity of this community and their belonging in greater Burmese society at a time. And we do that through chapter number 1. We use archival photographs that we were able to find, and also at the same time, we try to show some of those things that were common between everybody in Burma at a particular period of time. That would be how Rohingya shared the same kind of documentation as others, and through that documentation, that was recognition of citizenship, shows the extension of family going back in the country, the level of political participation that the Rohingya had at a particular period of time for at least 2 or 3 decades, and go from there. This whole first chapter is pretty much essential for people in terms of providing context in a world where we live right now, where visual context is always challenged. The very, very first chapter and the online experience really kind of anchors the exhibition and the story of the Rohingya into a context that we think is incredibly important for people to understand. So this is chapter 1. In chapter number 2, we then start to build in the playbook that took place that led up to 2017. We start to talk about how the Rohingya community was targeted in various different ways by the Burmese authorities, and what were the different tactics that the Burmese authorities took over decades to weaken this particular community, this particular community, the Rohingya community, and also at the same disenfranchise them and exclude them from all the different things that they had before everything started to go wrong. So chapter 2 really starts to dive into 2 different things, and that is, over the course of several decades, physical violence was perpetrated towards the Rohingya community, meaning certain waves of physical violence were perpetrated towards the Rohingya, which is violence that most of the world actually did see at a particular period of time. In 1978, and in 1991, and in 2012, the Rohingya and the physical violence perpetrated to them burst into the news and then evaporated at the same time. But in between these bursts of physical violence, there was this invisible form of violence, structural, systematic violence, that really the world didn't see, that in so many ways has laid the most damage onto the Rohingya community in leading up to 2012. And that would be policies such as, like Wai Wai mentioned, the 1982 Citizenship Law, various different local laws that took place that stripped the Rohingya of the ability to be able to prosper and participate in greater Burmese society, whether it's through the denial of education, through the rights to marriage, etc. What we've done through this exhibition and also through the physical installation is that we've built in a various forms of media into this. So in each chapter, on most of the chapters, there will be a video that we've created that's very visually driven, that kind of walks people through these kind of forms of violence that we're talking about. This particular one in chapter number 2 really spells out the kind of the path that the Burmese authorities took towards excluding this community, primarily through these forms of invisible violence that I've just talked about. And it's really important for people to know that throughout all these decades, there are perpetrators. There are certain particular individuals that were key as being architects towards this path that Burma took that led up to 2017. And also the public is built into that as well, which I'll go into in the next chapter. But that's really what chapter number 2 is all about, is talking about this pathway through the weakening of this community. Chapter 3, in a sense, then goes into something that's very relevant to today. And that is that how did the Burmese authorities over years build this acceptance from the wider Burmese public that this community didn't belong to Burma? How did they demonize this community through various tactics as well? Social media played a huge role, at least in the past 10 years, to doing this, towards spreading hate, towards othering this community, towards building this sense within the Burmese public that this is a community that has never belonged to Burma, to changing the narrative of who this particular community is in the eyes of the Burmese public. And that was done through primarily through the use of state-run media, through publications, and through social media. And this is one of the things that we go through in chapter number 3, is to just show how this community was demonized and othered by various organizations and various, I guess you could say, parts of Burma, in sense, primarily through the Burmese government and the military. And this chapter takes a deeper dive into different examples of how that was actually accomplished by the Burmese authorities. Chapter 4 then goes into actually focusing on the 2017 violence. What we chose to do in chapter number 4 was, there was violence that took place and massacres that took place all across the Rakhine state in 2017. What we ended up doing was, in the time that I've spent in Bangladesh over the past several years, since 2017, I've focused a lot of my attention on one particular village where there was a massacre that took place, and that's the village of Wai Wai Nu. So chapter 4 is very much, and so are the personal stories, very much focused on what happened to individuals in one particular village. And we're using that as a representation to then show how this is applicable to villages all across the Rakhine state. What we've done also throughout this exhibition and in the physical installation is that we've utilized assets and visuals that the Rohingya that actually themselves collected and have contributed and shared with us. This particular video in chapter number 4 consists of mobile phone videos that Rohingya took during the 2017 violence of their villages actually being burnt to the ground. And at the same time, in the next chapter, of mobile phone videos of people fleeing their villages to Bangladesh. So we've used visuals that the Rohingya community actually collected themselves and have built that into the online exhibition. The other challenging thing for us with the story of the Rohingya is, how do we visually translate genocide today? This was a big question for me as a photographer over all these years, but particularly with this exhibition, is how do we visually translate genocide? How do we challenge people to expand their understanding of the visual translation of genocide? All of the violence that took place in Rakhine State took place in a place that was off limits for the international community. North Rakhine State has been basically a blackout zone for many years. You can't get access to it. So all of the deaths and violence that took place, most people would never be able to see, and particularly Westerners. We'd never be able to get access to it. And at the same time, even after the violence was perpetrated, getting access to those places to actually to see the damage firsthand is pretty much impossible. So how do we visually translate genocide today? And that is through these particular stories, through the assets that we get from Rohingya themselves, and also at the same time using different techniques and representations of loss and of death. And so we've used lists that Rohingya actually have drawn up of people in their villages who were killed. We've used testimonies from people of family members. And as you'll see in chapter number 5, we take that to, I think, a really, really meaningful kind of level, where we talk about loss, but also at the same time, we talk about memory and the representation of death. Chapter number 5 is very much focused on the Rohingya community fleeing from Burma and what they carried with them, but also at the same time presenting this really, really intimate look at loss and death and genocide. And we do that through a number of different things. We talk about how sexual violence was used as a form of violence against the Rohingya in 2017 and the repercussions of that on people today. But also at the same time, I see that this screen here is not loading properly for me right now. We talk about children's drawings and the representation and memory that they have of what they saw and death in families. And also at the same time, you'll see that mobile phones seem to be this subtle character throughout all of the exhibition. How do we represent someone who's been killed in a genocide? For me as a photographer, I chose to take it this way. Knowing the history that I know of the Rohingya and what we hope to have presented to people at the beginning of the online exhibition, in the sense that this is a community that actually belonged, that had opportunity at a particular period of time. We wanted to humanize those people that were killed in the violence in 2017. But how do we do that? Well, one of the things that I found in doing my work and that we've incorporated in the exhibition is, just like everybody here on this call today, we all carry selfies around. We all carry photographs of our loved ones, of our family members on our mobile phones. Mobile phones today are a part of how we remember people, just like an old photo album was 20 years ago. Rohingya are exactly the same. They carry the memories of those that they loved and in their families with them. And I was able to find a number of people that had mobile phone photographs of people, of relatives that were actually killed in the 2017 violence. And we represent that collective of people and human beings from the Rohingya community through this collective of cell phone photographs of them. The next kind of chapter or pathway that I mentioned into this exhibition before I kind of conclude is through the personal stories themselves. And again, this talks about 6 different people or more from the Rohingya community, all from the village of Maung Nu, who are representative of the collective experience of Rohingya all over North Rakhine and Rakhine State in 2017. And you can go into each one of their stories and have a much more personal and intimate experience in terms of learning about their stories, about what their lives were like before 2017, what their lives happened to them during 2017, and what their lives are like now at post the 2017 violence. There's a number of other kind of things that in the online exhibition that you can explore as well, including a timeline that takes a deeper dive into, again, kind of this more detailed pathway of what led to 2017 and what's happening today. And that's really important for viewers in this exhibition, and that we do in the physical exhibition as well, is to show that this is not a situation that has ended, that this is not, that while we are providing a historical record, the reality of it is that this is still very much current, that the Rohingya community who are still living in Rakhine State are incredibly vulnerable and under threat. And those Rohingya that are living in Burma and Bangladesh today, they're living a pretty miserable existence, primarily because of the violence that took place in 2017. So we've tried to kind of approach this very, very complex story in a number of kind of different perspectives through the historical side of things, really laying out this path to genocide, while also at the same time trying to take some different approaches in terms of how we're exposing people to individual stories, but also at the same time challenging people in terms of how we visually translate genocide today, especially in regards to the Rohingya community and what's happened with Burma.
Wow. Well, I must say, Greg, that I find the exhibition truly remarkable. I mean, it goes into so many different layers. And what's interesting is how tools that we take for granted now have become everyday use in order to portray a story that we otherwise wouldn't have known. You know, as you said, you weren't allowed in many of the areas. So without them doing, you know, taking pictures on their cell phones, recording it in some way, we would really never know what truly happened behind the scenes. We have some questions. One is from Linda Heckner. Has there been any resistance from the Burmese who are not Rohingya? I don't know which of our panelists would like to answer that. Wai Wai, maybe this would be something you would like to answer.
Sure.
Okay,
So, sorry.
I wanted to know if you wanted me to repeat the question for you.
Yeah, sure. Has there been any resistance?
From Burmese who are not Rohingya?
So, yes. So it's Myanmar is a very interesting country to study, and in Myanmar, the Burmese ethnic Burmans are the majority population. So they held, or they're still holding power in the government. The majority in the government, majority are the Burman Burma ethnic group. Therefore, you know, the power is controlled by this dominant one group. And since after the independence, there has been promises toward the other ethnic minority groups on power sharing, equality, and as such. But the Burmese leadership didn't keep the promises, and the basically the ethnic communities are sort of you know, since then, ethnic community felt like they have not been treated fairly by Burmese people, Burmese leadership, as well as persecuted and discriminated in many ways. So basically, you know, apart from the Rohingya, many other ethnic minority groups in Myanmar are being discriminated and persecuted by the Burmese leadership, Burmese government. And therefore, there are many civil wars that's happened in Myanmar, and up to now we have insurgency and ongoing civil wars happening in Rakhine State, where the Rohingya are. So Rakhine State, between the Rakhine and Burmese ethnic group, a Burmese national military, And then in Kachin state, between the Kachin and Burmese national military, government military, we call them Temador. And then in Shan state, and even yesterday, this week, the violence and war broke out in Karen state. So basically, the Burmese government military is attacking the Karen like arms group. So the insurgency and resistance from these ethnic communities against the Burmese government or Burmese military on their mistreatment has been there for 6 decades now. But when it's come to the Rohingya, there hasn't been any there hasn't been a lot of like solidarity and support for the Rohingya because of these divisive divide and rule tactics and divisive policies by the Burmese government between the ethnic communities. There hasn't been much of solidarities, and especially for the Rohingya, it's quite rare. So, but there are some ethnic communities and groups that support Rohingya as well, but it's definitely very, very small number. So yeah, Rohingya had insurgency group in the past in late 1950s, and they surrendered. And then we had one small insurgency group in 1990s, and they surrendered as well. So right now we don't have like active the insurgency or active the arms group to defend our people. Although while many other ethnic community has their active and strong arms groups to defend the people, I would say, although it's creates so losses of damages against the populations in general. I hope that's the answer to the question.
And then Joan Krapp said, what items did they take with them when they had to flee? What kind of items?
I mean, I can chime in there.
Great.
I think that what's been really interesting about over the past several years is the fact that this northern area of Rakhine State, which is predominantly populated by the Rohingya community. I mean, Rakhine State has Rohingya all over, but particularly this area of Rakhine State, where all the violence took place. I mean, like I said, this is a place that has been kind of locked off away from the world for a very, very long time. Yet Rohingya have lived in this area for centuries. And what was interesting in this sense is that with this huge surge of Rohingya having to flee the military's actions in 2017, Rohingya kind of pretty much grabbed anything that they possibly could and that they could carry with them, as much as they could carry with them to Bangladesh. And some people, out of just pure desperation and in the level and the scale of the violence that was immediately happening at the time, a lot of people just left with nothing, which is completely understandable. But also at the same time, you have Rohingya that actually, besides their families, which are the most important thing in bringing and grabbing and bringing with them, it was certain pieces of artifacts that actually, I think in a way, most people have never seen before because you can't get access to North Rakhine. So you had Rohingya who recognized the importance of their documents. You had Rohingya who recognized the importance of historical artifacts that, in a way, they were thinking so far ahead of the time and saying, we're going to be pushed to Bangladesh. And for us to be able to make our claim as to why we should rightfully belong and be returned back to this place which we have called home for so many generations, we're going to need some kind of evidence to show that connection. So you have Rohingya now because of this genocide, this physical genocide that has taken place, actually leaving with documents that most people would never have seen before because Rakhine State was off limits to begin with, meaning IDs, historical documents, paperworks, landowner documents. I mean, it's really incredible to see the amount of paperwork that some Rohingya have carried with them, which they, in this terrible violence, registered as being some of the most important things for them to bring with them. And that has been, and you see, I mean, through this exhibition, we've tried to present a lot of a selection of those kind of really valuable pieces of information that they carried with them from Burma to Bangladesh that really establish and help to solidify their claim to belonging to Burma and to this place that they've called home for so long.
Great. Okay, Hilda Sandek-Lewin has asked, how many Rohingyas managed to settle in America? Did Wai Wai's family come to the US well before 2017?
I don't think I have the exact number of people who have been settled in the US. I don't know if Andrea and Greg has. I assume it's around perhaps, a couple of, a few thousands, like 5,000 to 10,000 maximum. We have about, I think most of them live in Chicago. We have about 500 or 600 family members in Chicago, and then the others are everywhere else. And some people settle in Wisconsin, and some lives in Indiana, and some are in LA. But yeah, it's not large number. And my family actually didn't move to the US. My family are still living inside Myanmar. So my immediate family lives in Yangon, which used to be capital, one of the main city in Myanmar, I would say. And my extended families, like my uncles, aunties, and my grandma, still lives in Rakhine State in very difficult conditions, as I described. So without having any freedom, and living under fear, and because simply because they have to live there and they cannot go anywhere else. And we can also see some people try to flee from Rakhine State are being arrested time to times if they are found by the if they're caught by the Myanmar security forces, and they've been penalized. So it's basically you have to live in this, what they describe as open prison, and there is no way to flee, even to escape from that environment. If you do, like many people take, many people basically try their way out by using many channels. In many cases, as I said, they can be caught by the Burmese security forces in the middle, or in some cases, people are, people take this boat to flee to Malaysia or elsewhere, and then in a lot of the time they've been abused and tortured and by these traffickers, and sometimes they can even be killed or died out of hunger if they're stranded on the sea. So yeah, it's not easy in terms of leaving from Rakhine State, escaping Rakhine State. So still there are many people living inside Rakhine State. We have about 600,000 people still living in Rakhine State, Myanmar. And that include my extended family members, my relatives. and my immediate family lives in Rangoon. I am here in United States in Washington D.C. right now. I came here for a few years ago to do my my study here, and then I'm staying now as fellows. Basically, one of the reason is because it's not very safe for me to be inside and to do what I do.
Okay, so Pilar if I hope I'm getting your name correctly, Pilar Elizelda, thank you for the presentation and for such an interesting exhibition. What were the most sensitive or difficult decisions you had to make, if any, while putting together and curating this exhibition? I think that's for Andrea and Greg.
Sure, I'm happy to start and then turn it over to Greg. I think at a fundamental level, we approach this project with a lot of humility. And the people who work at the Holocaust Museum, Greg, with the exception of Wai Wai, we're not Rohingya, and we understand that we're telling a very important story of another community, and that's not something to take lightly. So with that came a lot of questions, as Greg explained during his walkthrough, of how we tell a complicated history, how we respect the dignity of the community. And we did this by involving a lot of different advisors in the process. It wasn't just the staff of the Holocaust Museum and Greg as the curator who put this together. We really drew upon a number of experts from diverse backgrounds to kind of check our assumptions and make sure that the path that we're approaching seemed right. I also think it was also a challenge to take a very complicated and long history of a people. Every population has a long, complicated history, and we're trying to compress that into something that people can understand relatively quickly. People who perhaps have never heard of Burma, have never heard of the Rohingya, and that's also quite challenging too. So how do you kind of thread that needle, making sure people get a compelling story of what happened, while really trying to be as comprehensive as possible? I might turn it over to Greg, because I'm sure he has thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I mean, Andrea touched on pretty much, I mean, all of the sensitivities involved. I mean, I think that one of the big things for us is that we wanted to make sure that, that the Rohingya community was actually played a part in terms of helping to make sure that we were being accurate, that we were representing the community in an accurate kind of way, while also at the same time having a large number of people not from the Rohingya community acting and serving as advisors for us during this, to just make sure that we were staying on our guardrails the way that we should in terms of putting the story together and how we were telling it. I mean, outside of that, you always come into, I find that, representation is such a key thing right now. Agency is a really important thing. How do we make sure that individuals in this exhibition, that the nuances in this are really thought through rigorously in that sense? There's a lot of, it's really also important for this exhibition to show that the Rohingya, in a way, are just one of many communities in Burma that have faced persecution by the Burmese government. But I think there were a number of different sensitivities involved in curating the exhibition. I mean, this is the reason why working with an institution like the Holocaust Museum for me has been an amazing experience. And by having the time and working with such an intelligent, creative group of people, of colleagues there at the museum, in talking this over, having the time and the space to be able to talk about it and vet through some of these very sensitive elements, being able to really look at not only the visuals, but the text in a way that we have, and making sure that the nuance of the story is actually captured in the text. I mean, one word can make a very big difference in exhibitions like this. And to have multiple minds and eyes looking over things, both from the Rohingya community, from the Holocaust Museum, from myself, from the team involved, played a really, really important part in making sure that we were capturing as much as we could. I mean, with the exhibition. So yeah, it was a really amazing exhibition to curate and to put together. And because a huge amount of the work in it is actually work that of my work over these past 14 years, it was really great to kind of allow other people to put in their input in terms of what worked and what didn't work in each one of these particular chapters. And it was an amazing experience, but one that I think having the time to be able to do it really was crucial.
Okay, so Linda, would you like to put your video on? Linda Heckner has a question or a comment.
I'm Heather. Hello everybody. Thank you for a really wonderful evening. I'm not putting my video on because I wasn't expecting to be in public, so I'm not putting my video on. But you know, all the time that I've been listening to this and looking at the exhibition, and because I'm so immersed in Holocaust education, I know we don't conflate, but the broad strokes are there all the time, that these genocides take the same form kind of over and over again with different nuance, as you said, Greg. And I was wondering, because with the Holocaust, there was this constant drip feeding of anti-Jewish stuff through radio, through whatever means. Was that going on at the time? Was it, what I can't kind of get my head around was it major things like your citizenship disappears, etc., etc., or was the general population being constantly sort of almost like tortured with drop feeding anti-Rohingya propaganda?
I mean, I can add to that. I think that in trying to tell the story that we've told through this exhibition, I think you're very accurate in that assumption. I think that over several decades, you will see that there is this kind of this base level of information being pushed out to the Burmese public through a variety of different means that are slowly reshaping the minds of people and their attitudes towards the Rohingya community in particular, and Muslims in Burma as well. And that can take any number of different forms. I mean, for some decades it was maybe much less, but when you see the kind of the proliferation of social media post 2011, in Burma, where the country in a way was opening up to reforms, where prior to that, you know, mobile phones and SIM cards were so expensive that nobody was able to do it, then almost overnight changing to where everybody in Burma had access to a mobile phone. And on that mobile device was loaded Facebook. And on Facebook, people, authorities, recognize that as being a platform for being able to amplify these kind of tactics of othering of the community. So post 2011, you really see this kind of surge in anti-Rohingya, anti-Muslim messaging through a variety of different people. And that came not just from the military government, but you also saw that within more nationalistic extremist factions within the Buddhist community in Burma as well. And we show that in the exhibition, meaning that there are, journals that were published by different extremist wings or non-extremist wings of the Buddhist Religious Society in Burma that were actually subtly propagating this sense of this community not belonging, or planting the seed that this community were infiltrating Burma or were terrorists, all these different tactics that were being taken. But like you said, it's this kind of this slow drip over decades that ends up creating a situation that led to supporting what happened in 2017.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Unfortunately, Wai Wai has to go to another appointment. So I'm sorry that you have to leave us. This is a very interesting discussion. We have got so many questions for you. But thank you so much for giving of your time, sharing part of your story. I don't think that this is the last time we're going to see you. I think that we will be sharing the screen with you in the next few months as well. Thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful project. And I wish you lots of luck.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that I had to leave. I have another meeting, but it's been a great discussions, and thank you for hosting. And thank you, Greg and Andrea. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope to see you maybe, in another opportunity. Have a great day.
Thanks, Wai Wai. Andrea and Greg, are you happy to answer some more questions that are flying through here? Okay, so the next question is from Lee Boyskin. What are the religious commonalities? Are there any religious commonalities?
Religious commonalities between?
I would imagine commonalities between the Burmese and the Rohingya and other smaller communities.
I mean, just briefly, religiously, most or almost all Rohingya are Muslim. There are a number of other religious minorities in Burma, which is majority Buddhist, but there are Christians, there are others. A lot of the religious minorities have been persecuted, as Wai Wai mentioned earlier. There are different Christian communities, Muslim communities. There are Muslims who are not Rohingya who have been targeted, who have faced persecution and violence as well. And I think what we've seen, kind of going back to a question that was asked earlier, we have seen some points of solidarity among religious communities, and also from some Buddhists who have stood up against what has been happening to the Rohingya. But the Rohingya themselves are mostly, if not entirely, Muslim. Yeah.
Okay, so John Lifferton has said, has the international Buddhist community condemned the Burmese Buddhist community? And if so, what has the impact been?
I mean, there have been many people internationally, especially people in the Buddhist community, some very well-respected leaders. Well-respected from across a number of religious traditions, but including Buddhism, who have spoken out about what is happening. And I think in terms of the effect of that, I think we're seeing limited movement, at least at the official levels in Burma, in terms of how the government has been taking that on. The government, I think, has been, and the military has remained relatively firm that genocide has not happened, admitting that some violence has taken place, but not on the scale or with the intentionality that we have seen. But I think it is important to know that there are leaders from, the Dalai Lama, that the Pope has spoken out on this, very, well-known religious leaders who have, expressed their concern and their solidarity with the Rohingya people who have been facing this genocide.
Greg, have you got anything more to add to that? I mean, you've spent a number of years living in that area. What has been your perception of how outspoken people have been or not been?
Well, I think that my experience has been kind of, again, I'm kind of coming at this a little bit subjective, but, if you look at it within like the Southeast Asia context, I mean, it's the Rohingya are living in an area that is predominantly Buddhist, but also at the same time, it's almost as if like you have to separate the religious side of things and see just how political this issue is in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. I mean, I won't go too far into that, but you know, the political calculations that go into how people are speaking for or staying silent related to what's happening in the Rohingya community are wrapped all in the history of this, particularly since, you know, let's say 2012. So you see some nations in Southeast Asia that are much more, that have historically been a little bit much more open and receptive to what's happening and vocal about what's happening to Rohingya, whether it's Malaysia or Indonesia. But also at the same time, you have some of those same countries who have been very vocal about the atrocities that are taking place at certain times, have been very standoffish about accepting Rohingya who are fleeing their countries. Or fleeing Burma as well. So, you know, the political element of this, I guess, like a lot of other situations around the world, is incredibly intense and complicated as well. And it's something that people need to be aware of when they're learning about this story, particularly now after 2017 too, the current situation of what's happening now. So, yeah.
Take one last question, and that's from Ursula Gapley. What is the international community doing to assist the refugees in Bangladesh? And what is being done to stop the ongoing atrocities being committed in Myanmar?
So those are two good questions, and they're certainly related. There are quite a number of efforts on the second question to prevent future mass atrocities, future acts, future crimes against the Rohingya and others in Burma. Really, Rohingya who have fled to Bangladesh, which there are now over 1 million people living in Bangladesh who have fled violence, they cannot return home until they can return home to a peaceful future. And there needs to be serious systematic change, institutional change, in order to create the kinds of conditions necessary for their return. Different governments have been pressing the Burmese government to take on just certain steps, such as restoring citizenship for the Rohingya, promoting accountability for the crimes that have happened. Various states have supported efforts, for example, at the International Court of Justice, which looks at state responsibility and whether Burma has flouted its obligations under the Genocide Convention, looking at ways to improve the kinds of services and access and rights that Rohingya would enjoy. Right now, we're pretty far removed from the practical implementation of a lot of those steps. The Holocaust museums and our centers for Friends International Justice Initiative actually is releasing a report to look at what practically the Burmese government could do in order to prevent genocide against the Rohingya in the future, and has laid out a number of steps in that regard. But right now, the government is not adhering to those obligations. So for the refugees in Bangladesh, they're facing quite a long-term protracted situation where they likely will not be able to safely return home for some time. In terms of support for the refugees, I mean, a number of countries, US included, and quite a number of others, are providing financial assistance to organizations who are providing necessary services in the camps. And Greg can speak more about this, just being very familiar with the camp settings. Camps are overcrowded. The need for services is quite great. There are restrictions on accessing higher education, on working, on just basic fundamental parts of everyone's life. There are some concerning trends with how Rohingya are being treated. I saw an earlier question about whether they have a path to citizenship in Bangladesh, and that's sadly not the case. So I do think we're looking at a protracted situation where the full needs, demands, and rights of the Rohingya refugee population are not yet fully being met, either in Bangladesh, nor if they were to to return to Burma. I'm sure Greg has more to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the time that I've spent in the camps, and I've been, you know, I've been visiting the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh since 2006, but particularly after 2017. I mean, it's just enormous. It's sprawling, the number of Rohingya that are in need in Bangladesh. And like Andrea said, I mean, there's been the international community has been very dedicated towards recognizing the importance of providing assistance for this enormous community of Rohingya in Bangladesh. But I guess when you talk with Rohingya in day to day who are living there, it doesn't take very long to pretty much realize that a generation of Rohingya are really, their lives have been put on pause. I mean, if not more than just a generation of Rohingya. You know, like Andrea said, I mean, access to higher education is not there. You know, I guess you could say, any level of formality in terms of being able to work legally, provide for your family, go to school, know that you have a future, and be able to see those points in line for what you want and hope for your future have pretty much been, you know, wiped out and erased for the Rohingya who are living in the camps right now. But one of the things that's really, I think, crucial for people to understand is that, you know, the Rohingya are a determined, resilient, talented, resourceful community. That's one of the reasons why we show the historical part of what this community had in the exhibition. You know, there was a time when Rohingya were members of parliament. There was a time when Rohingya were college educated graduates and doctors and lawyers and engineers and worked in civil society. There was a time when the Rohingya was just played a part in greater society. And that right now is not a reality for Rohingya who are in their 30s, 40s, and for those Rohingya who have the energy in their 20s to want to see a future for themselves and their families. Those opportunities are just not there. And I think that's one of the many tragedies of this story, is that, like Andrea said, I mean, this is a protracted situation where no one really seems to know when things will be solved. And in that interim time period, which I would imagine, I think everybody else would probably imagine, I think Rohingya recognize is going to be years. I mean, it's already been 4 years, 3.5 years since 2017. And it will be many more for Rohingya to feel like their community can go, you know, can revisit this life that they once had, but that takes a lot of solutions that are very complicated to achieve. But in the camps, you know, they persist.
Thank you, Greg. I'd like to thank both you, Greg and Andrea, for participating tonight. It was incredibly interesting, and I would really urge our friends at the center to actually go onto our website and to explore the exhibition. It's very interactive. It is very interesting, and I promise you, you can sit for hours actually watching either the videos or reading the stories. It's been exceptionally well done. We as a center are very honored that we were able to partner with you on this exhibition. It certainly is very exciting for us. And be safe, be well, be healthy, and please God, we will see you soon. Thank you everybody for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.